You are now listening to A Room with a View by E.M Forster. This is the story of Lucy Honeychurch, a young woman torn between propriety and passion, between what society expects and what her heart desires. Set across the elegance of Edwardian England and the warmth of Florence, Italy, the novel explores love, freedom, and the courage it takes to choose your own path. Chapter 1. Lucy Honeychurch and her cousin Charlotte Bartlett had just arrived in Florence, staying at the Pension Bertolini, a guest house recommended to them for its supposed charm and, more importantly, its rooms with a view. But as the two women sat down to dinner in the stiff, awkward dining room filled with other English tourists, disappointment hung in the air. Charlotte was visibly upset. "The signora had no business to do it," she muttered with an edge in her voice. "She promised us south-facing rooms with a view. Instead, we're stuck in tiny rooms facing a dark courtyard, and worse, we're on opposite ends of the hall." Lucy tried to be diplomatic, but her disappointment showed. "And a Cockney, Charlotte," she added, referring to the accent of the guest house manager. "I feel like we're back in London." The dining room, with its faded grandeur and forced civility, was filled with other English guests, mostly keeping to themselves. The walls were decorated with stiff portraits and notices from the English church. Florence, for all its romantic promise, still felt very far away. Charlotte made a few pointed comments about the soup and the quality of meat, clearly letting her irritation show. Lucy sighed, her mind on the Arno River she had yet to see. The promised view had been her dream. They were still speaking in quiet frustration when an older man sitting nearby suddenly leaned over and offered an unexpected solution. "You can have our rooms," he said matter-of-factly. "We'll take yours." The man, Mr. Emerson, was blunt and completely unbothered by the usual layers of social etiquette. He introduced his son George, sitting quietly beside him, and repeated his offer to switch rooms. Miss Bartlett, alarmed by his forwardness, stiffened. "That's quite out of the question," she said, her voice icy. Mr. Emerson didn't understand why. "Women like a view, men don't," he insisted. "It's obvious you should have the rooms." George, his son, added gently, "There's nothing else to say. They should have them." Lucy was taken aback. This wasn't just about hotel rooms. Something about the older man's persistence and the younger man's quiet sincerity unnerved her. They weren't behaving like the reserved English tourists she was used to. There was no small talk, no decorum, just directness. Miss Bartlett, whose travel expenses were partly paid by Lucy's mother, felt both obligated and cornered. Her rejection of the offer became less about politeness and more about control, and perhaps pride. The tension broke when a familiar face entered the room. Mr. Beebe, a clergyman Lucy had met in England. She was delighted, and his arrival helped smooth over the awkward dinner. As the evening wore on, guests began warming up. Conversations sparked, mostly driven by a clever, talkative woman who insisted that Lucy and Charlotte must visit Prato for its sweetly squalid charm. Florence was slowly opening up, but George Emerson remained apart from the chatter. He barely spoke, avoiding eye contact, and quietly watched the room, especially Lucy. She noticed his distance and felt an odd mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Later, back in the drawing room, Mr. Beebe caught up with Lucy and Miss Bartlett. Their chat turned again to the Emersons. Miss Bartlett expressed concern about their offer, hinting that it would place Lucy under an uncomfortable social obligation. Mr. Beebe disagreed gently. "He's not trying to obligate you. He says what he means. That's rare enough." Miss Bartlett remained cautious. Is he a socialist? Mr. Beebe smiled. He probably is, and perhaps his son too. Eventually, with Mr. Beebe's help, Mr. Emerson renewed the offer through more acceptable channels. Miss Bartlett finally relented, but not without drama. She made it clear that Lucy was not to be blamed and asked that the thanks be delivered through George, as Mr. Emerson was in the bath. George stood in front of them, silent but composed. Miss Bartlett was flustered. She found it impossible to be civil. George, however, remained polite, scoring a quiet victory in the awkward exchange. As the evening drew to a close, Lucy found herself surrounded by chatter once more. An elderly woman shared stories about Italy, about safety, and about shutting bedroom windows to keep the night air out. Lucy listened, but her mind wandered. There was something about the Emersons, their honesty, their oddness, that lingered in her thoughts. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she sensed something important had just begun. Chapter 2. Lucy Honeychurch woke to sunlight spilling into her room. The curtains were thin, the morning air crisp. Her new room, courtesy of the Emersons, faced the Arno, just as promised. She opened the window and leaned out, taking in Florence for the first time with a sense of real excitement. The rooftops, the river, the distant hills, it all shimmered in the morning light. It was the view she'd imagined when they first set out from England. Across the water, men worked on the riverbanks with sieves and shovels. An electric tram clattered past, half empty, while soldiers marched stiffly down the road. Children ran alongside the tram, trying to jump on the back before being waved off. There was so much movement, so much life. Even the oxen pulling carts from under the archways seemed part of the show. It was beautiful and chaotic, and it felt like freedom. Her cousin Charlotte, ever vigilant, knocked and entered without waiting. She disapproved of Lucy leaning out the window in her nightgown. "You'll catch a chill," she scolded gently. "You shouldn't keep the door unlocked either." Lucy hurried to get dressed. By the time she finished, Charlotte had already eaten breakfast and was chatting with another guest, a woman named Miss Lavish. A self-proclaimed writer and full of opinions, Miss Lavish wore a military-style cloak and had strong ideas about Italy, art, and society. She had decided that Lucy needed a proper adventure. Charlotte, still nursing a headache, reluctantly agreed to let Miss Lavish take Lucy out for the morning. "Only because you're with a lady," she said with a cautious look at Miss Lavish. "But do be careful." And with that, Lucy found herself walking through the sunny streets of Florence beside her eccentric new guide. Miss Lavish was thrilled. She chatted nonstop, pointing out buildings, sharing stories about local aristocrats, and proclaiming how refreshing it was to shake off the trammels of respectability. They turned off the main road into a grimy little alley. Miss Lavish sniffed the air with pleasure. Every city has its smell. This is Florence, she said dramatically. "Is it a nice smell?" Lucy asked uncertainly. "One doesn't come to Italy for niceness," Miss Lavish replied. "One comes for life." The comment hung in the air. As they passed a wine cart, Miss Lavish called out a cheerful "Buongiorno" to the driver. "Look how he stares. A dear simple soul," she whispered with delight. She turned to Lucy, placing a hand on her arm. "A little civility to your inferiors is the truest form of democracy." "I am a real radical," Lucy smiled, trying to keep up. "My father voted for Mr. Gladstone," she offered, wanting to contribute. Miss Lavish nodded approvingly. "Until he went all dreadful about Ireland, yes, but surely you've switched sides by now." Lucy hesitated. "Maybe." Freddie, my brother, says the Tories broke our front door glass during the last election. They laughed, and for a moment, England felt very far away. But soon they realized they were lost. The charming shortcut Miss Lavish had promised had twisted them into unfamiliar alleys. Rather than backtrack, she insisted they keep wandering. "This is an adventure," she cried. "Let's drift." Drift they did, past streets that weren't charming at all, until they stumbled into a square. It wasn't Santa Croce, their intended destination, but the Piazza della Santissima Annunziata, with its stately buildings and rows of terracotta angels. Lucy was enchanted. But Miss Lavish, unimpressed, steered them away again. Eventually, they reached a large, dusty piazza with a stunning black and white church at its far end. Santa Croce, at last. But just as they approached the steps, Miss Lavish froze. Two tourists were heading the same way. Two men from dinner the previous night. "I detest conventional intercourse," she said with a shudder. "Let's wait. They're dreadful types. So British." "But they gave us their rooms," Lucy reminded her. Miss Lavish waved that off. "They walk through my Italy like cows. I would set an exam at Dover and send half of them home." As Miss Lavish launched into another theatrical rant, she suddenly spotted a man with white whiskers and rushed off after him, her cloak flapping behind her. Lucy was left alone. She stood on the steps, feeling awkward. Beggars approached. Dust blew into her eyes. It was improper for a young woman to loiter like this, but Miss Lavish had vanished down a side street. Lucy's excitement about Florence was rapidly unraveling. Tears prickled in her eyes. This had been her first morning in a new city, and now she was alone and embarrassed. She decided to enter the church on her own. Inside it was quiet and grand. The cool stone echoed with footsteps and the murmurs of tourists reading their Baedekers. Lucy wandered uncertainly. She saw children mistake Machiavelli's tomb for a saint's, their mother letting them pray to him with innocent reverence. Suddenly, a loud voice interrupted. "Hateful bishop!" It was Mr. Emerson, the older man from the pension. He stepped forward and helped a little boy who had fallen. "Go out into the sunshine, little boy," he added kindly. The child's mother comforted him with practiced ease. Mr. Emerson watched her with admiration. "You're clever," he said. "You've done more good than all the relics." Lucy was nearby, having seen the whole thing. She found herself smiling, feeling differently about Mr. Emerson now. There was something blunt but honest about him. "You're here alone?" he asked, surprised. "Yes, Miss Lavish ran off." "And took your guidebook too, I bet," he said with a chuckle. George Emerson appeared beside his father, quiet and serious. "You should come with us," Mr. Emerson offered. Lucy hesitated but declined politely. Still, she didn't walk away. She felt strangely drawn in. They joined a small lecture group, listening to a clergyman explaining the church's artwork. Mr. Emerson disrupted the quiet voice with one of his own, louder and more direct. "Built by faith? Rubbish. It just means the workers weren't paid properly." The tourists were scandalized. The little group disbanded, offended by his lack of reverence. Mr. Emerson, seeing the reaction, hurried after them to apologize, leaving Lucy alone with George. He seemed weighed down by everything. By his father, by life. "People find him out and get scared or offended," he explained. Lucy defended kindness. George shook his head. "Tact is just lies," he said. They stood near a fresco, the sunlight shifting across the colors. Lucy felt something stir in her, a fleeting connection that confused her. Mr. Emerson returned, out of breath, having tried to apologize to the others. He turned to Lucy. Let my boy see the yes in life, not just the why. I tried to teach him truth, but it made him sad. Lucy, overwhelmed, tried to offer some advice about work or hobbies, but it felt useless. The old man was talking about something deeper, about a way of seeing the world. George interrupted them quietly. "Miss Bartlett's here." Lucy turned quickly. Her cousin was approaching. The spell was broken. She walked away, wondering what, exactly, had just happened. Chapter 3. The rain had settled in over Florence, casting a moody stillness over the Pension Bertolini. Most of the guests had retreated to their rooms or their books. But Lucy Honeychurch had found something far better than either: a piano. She sat alone at the instrument in the common room, her fingers dancing over the keys. The sonata she played wasn't perfect, but it was honest. There were wrong notes, yes, but they didn't matter. Lucy didn't play like a trained professional. She played like someone who felt deeply. Her music was raw, emotional, and full of longing. It wasn't something that could be taught. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Beebe had slipped into the room and was listening. He remembered the first time he'd heard her play, back in Tunbridge Wells at a charity event. She had played a piece by Beethoven then, too, and the sheer passion in her playing had surprised him. It was like watching someone's soul break through the surface of who they were supposed to be. As Lucy finished the piece, she turned to find Mr. Beebe at the window, smiling. "You play wonderfully," he said. "If you ever live as you play, it will be very exciting, for us and for you." Lucy laughed lightly. "Mother says I must never live a duet." Mr. Beebe chuckled. Mothers are practical. Their conversation wandered, as rainy day chats often do. They talked about the weather, the oddities of fellow guests, and the unpredictability of Florence. Charlotte and Miss Lavish, for example, had gone off sightseeing again, despite the rain. Lucy seemed restless, her eyes flicking toward the window. The city was calling to her. She felt hemmed in by the pension, by the endless rules and polite obligations. Even Miss Lavish, for all her talk of freedom, seemed trapped in her own sense of what a proper adventure should be. "I think I'll go for a walk," Lucy said suddenly. Mr. Beebe looked concerned. "You'll get soaked." "I don't mind." She wanted to move, to breathe, to get out of the proper and polite. Even the pouring rain couldn't dampen her need to escape the static air of the guest house. As she left, the notes of Beethoven still lingered in her head. Meanwhile, back inside, conversations unfolded in layers. The older guests gossiped gently. Miss Allen, one of the long-staying Englishwomen, exchanged comments with Mr. Beebe about the newcomers and their oddities. The main topic of the day, however, was the Emersons, particularly George. No one quite knew what to make of him. Mr. Emerson, the father, was odd but easy to categorize. Rude, maybe, but at least open. George, though, was different. He didn't say much, and when he did, he seemed to be thinking about something else entirely. There was a kind of sadness about him that unsettled people. Miss Lavish, it turned out, had her own theories about George Emerson and his father. She claimed they were not who they appeared to be, that they had a past, something literary or revolutionary, perhaps. Miss Allen was more generous. "Mr. Emerson seems well-intentioned," she offered, though quite impossible, of course. And so the day wore on, rainy and slow. In the corner of the lounge, someone played cards. Tea was poured, umbrellas dripped in the hallway, and the Pension Bertolini returned to its quiet rhythm. Outside, Lucy walked through the wet streets, Florence glittering in the puddles. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she didn't want to stay still. Chapter 4. Lucy Honeychurch wasn't quite sure what she was looking for that afternoon. Maybe it was freedom, maybe just distraction. The rain had stopped, and Florence, even under a dull sky, buzzed with color and life. She wandered the streets, taking in the sculptures, the markets, the rhythm of a city that seemed centuries ahead and behind all at once. Eventually, she found herself in a print shop, flipping through photographs of famous paintings. She paused at Botticelli's Birth of Venus, a nude, yes, but somehow beautiful in a way that didn't feel scandalous. She added it to her purchases, along with a few others. Her cousin Charlotte would probably disapprove, but Lucy didn't mind. She was tired of always doing what was expected. With her prints bundled under her arm, she strolled toward the Piazza Signoria, where the heart of Florence beat strongest. The square was bathed in soft orange light from the setting sun. Statues loomed, shadows lengthened, and the air held that strange stillness that comes just before something happens. And then, it happened. Two Italian men near the loggia were arguing, shouting about money. One shoved the other, then pulled out a knife. The scuffle turned violent in seconds. The victim staggered back, clutching his stomach, blood suddenly streaking his chin. Lucy stood frozen. He looked right at her, not with accusation, not with fear, just a look. Then he collapsed. There was screaming. A crowd gathered. Lucy swayed on her feet, her vision blurred, the sky tilted. She fainted. When she opened her eyes, she was on the steps of a building, her head resting gently, her bundle of prints on the ground. George Emerson was crouched beside her. He had carried her away from the chaos, set her down safely, and was brushing dust from his knees. "What happened?" she murmured. "You fainted," he said softly. Lucy felt herself go red. "Oh, that was silly." George didn't respond. He was watching her with that same unreadable expression he always wore, somewhere between confusion and concern. She noticed her prints were missing. "My photos," George glanced toward the square. "They were stained. I threw them into the Arno." Lucy blinked. "You what?" "They had blood on them." He said it without drama, without apology. And yet there was something protective in the gesture. It struck Lucy unexpectedly. They walked in silence, passing the Arno now glowing under street lamps. A cab passed. George declined it. Lucy said nothing. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for all the fuss. It wasn't your fault." They stopped near the river, leaning on the parapet. George looked out over the water, then turned to her. "I wanted to help," he said. "You were alone." His voice was quiet, but full of weight. Lucy didn't know what to say. Something unspoken hung between them, and she wasn't ready to name it. When they returned to the pension, she stopped him at the steps. "Please don't tell anyone I fainted," she said, "especially not Charlotte." George paused, then nodded. "Promise?" "I promise." He turned and walked inside. Lucy remained at the door, watching the light ripple on the cobblestones, still feeling the heat of his hand on her arm, the echo of something strange and serious between them. Inside, Florence ticked on, unchanged, eternal. But something inside Lucy had shifted, and she couldn't yet explain what. Chapter 5. Charlotte Bartlett, usually the picture of overreaction, surprised everyone, including Lucy, by being remarkably calm about what had happened in the square. Lucy gave her a carefully edited version of the event: a minor scuffle, a faint spell, nothing more. She didn't mention George Emerson, the blood, or how deeply shaken she had truly been. Charlotte nodded along. She and Miss Lavish had apparently faced their own ordeal on the way back. Something about suspicious customs officers at the city gates checking bags for cheese. The drama of their return became the evening's entertainment, and Lucy's secret stayed tucked away. But that night in the quiet of her room, Lucy couldn't sleep. She turned the story over in her mind again and again. The man's eyes, the blood, George's voice, the river. There was no one she could talk to about it, and that loneliness pressed in like a second skin. The next morning, Mr. Beebe invited Lucy and Charlotte on the walk to the Torre del Gallo, a scenic overlook of Florence. Lucy was about to agree when Charlotte, clearly hoping for a restful day indoors, offered to go change money and run errands instead. She encouraged Lucy to go on without her, but something in Lucy resisted. "No, Charlotte, I'll come with you." Her voice was firm, almost too eager, as though she needed to prove her loyalty. Charlotte looked surprised, even pleased. "Oh well, very well, dear." And just like that, Lucy had made her decision. She would not go walking with the Emersons. She would not risk more confusion. She would escape the tangle by stepping away from it. As they walked together along the Lung Arno, Charlotte remarked wistfully, "How I do wish Freddie and your mother could see this." Lucy fidgeted. They were standing in the very place where the incident had happened, and it was all still there. The river, the wind, the memory. "I'm not watching for the others, if that's what you mean," Lucy said, trying not to sound defensive. Charlotte didn't push. They moved on. Soon they found themselves in the Piazza Signoria again. Lucy tried not to react to the bloodstains, long since scrubbed away, or the memories clinging to the shadows. It didn't work. The stones seemed to whisper the truth back to her. And then, as if summoned by the ghosts of yesterday, Miss Lavish appeared, full of energy, gripping a newspaper. She was writing a novel now, she declared, a tale set in Italy, inspired by a terrible incident in the square. "Such luck!" she exclaimed. "Tragedy is just what I needed." Charlotte offered her congratulations. Lucy, alarmed, just wanted to disappear. "Tell me everything you saw," Miss Lavish said, locking eyes with Lucy. Lucy poked the ground with her parasol. "I'd rather not talk about it." Miss Lavish didn't press, but her excitement was undiminished. She described the plot of her upcoming book, full of local color, dramatic deaths, and of course a cast of ridiculous British tourists. "Oh, you wicked woman," Charlotte teased. "You're writing about the Emersons." "In Italy," Miss Lavish said with a sly smile, "my sympathies lie with the Italians." After parting ways, Lucy and Charlotte ran into Mr. Eager, the clergyman. He invited them on a carriage ride into the hills to see a spot painted by an obscure Renaissance artist, Alessio Baldovinetti. Charlotte, always eager to appear cultured, accepted enthusiastically. Lucy hesitated, but when she learned Mr. Beebe would also be there, she brightened. At least it wouldn't be just them and Mr. Eager. As they walked, the conversation turned back, inevitably, to the events in the square. "Miss Honeychurch was there," Charlotte said proudly. "Indeed?" Mr. Eager turned to Lucy. "And what were you doing alone, if I may ask?" Charlotte jumped in, taking full responsibility. "It was my fault. I had left her briefly with a friend." Mr. Eager's curiosity deepened, but Lucy kept her answers vague. She didn't want to discuss it. She didn't want to remember. In the middle of this uncomfortable exchange, a street vendor appeared trying to sell photographs. Mr. Eager, clearly annoyed, lashed out, tearing one of the prints in frustration. Lucy felt a ripple of unease. She hadn't expected Florence to feel so full of conflict, or that clergymen could be so temperamental. Later, as they wandered through a shop, Mr. Eager lowered his voice and leaned toward Lucy. "There's something you ought to know about the Emersons," he said gravely. Lucy froze. "His father," Mr. Eager said, meaning George's, "was a laborer, a socialist." married above his station, and there's more, a darkness. Lucy stared at him. What kind of darkness? Murder, Mr. Eager whispered. He murdered his wife. It felt like a slap. Lucy backed away. I don't believe that. Mr. Eager shrugged. Believe what you like. I just thought you should be warned. It didn't make sense. Whatever Mr. Emerson was, he wasn't a murderer, and George was complicated, yes, but dangerous? Still rattled, Lucy suggested they go visit the Vyses in Rome instead, a family they knew from England. Charlotte seemed surprised, even amused. I thought we were going on the drive with Mr. Beebe. Lucy forced a laugh. Oh, we can do both. And with that, they continued through the city, arm in arm, two women pushing forward, trying to pretend the past few days hadn't changed anything. But Florence had marked Lucy, and the more she tried to escape it, the more it seemed to follow. Chapter 6. The sun was bright as the carriages set out from Florence, climbing slowly up into the Tuscan hills. The outing had been Mr. Eager's idea, a peaceful drive to a picturesque spot once painted by Baldo Venetti. But peace wasn't exactly what followed. The group was mismatched from the start. Lucy sat beside Miss Lavish, who wore her usual dramatic flair. Mr. Emerson dozed beside them, lulled by the motion of the carriage. Mr. Eager, seated across from Lucy, held a copy of Baedeker and a strict sense of morality. And then there was the young carriage driver, wild-haired and flirtatious, who insisted on bringing his sister along for the ride. Her name, supposedly, was Persephone. She sat on the front seat, allowing the driver's arm to rest easily around her waist. Mr. Eager pretended not to notice, though his jaw clenched visibly. Miss Lavish, at first delighted by the rustic romance, began to frown. Lucy, caught in the middle, didn't know where to look. In the second carriage followed George Emerson, Mr. Beebe, and Charlotte Bartlett. It was, perhaps, a better arrangement, until the hills made conversation difficult and the scenery took over. Despite the tension, the day was beautiful. The road wound past olive groves and sunlit valleys. The air smelled of wild flowers and dust. Birds darted overhead. For a while no one spoke, and that silence was almost healing. But then, inevitably, the driver leaned in and kissed the girl beside him. The carriage jolted as Mr. Eager stood up, furious. "This is unacceptable," he snapped. "Stop the carriage!" The driver shrugged. "She's my sister." "She most certainly is not." Lucy looked at Miss Lavish, expecting her to defend the young couple, but she had gone silent, uncomfortable now that fantasy had become real. Mr. Emerson, barely awake, waved a hand dismissively. "Let them be," he muttered. But Mr. Eager wouldn't. He scolded the driver, ordered the girl down, and eventually got his way. The girl was left behind with a relative, and the carriage moved on, now full of silence and disapproval. Later, as the group disembarked to explore the hilltop, the awkwardness remained. People wandered off in pairs. Mr. Eager tried to lead a small lecture about Baldovinetti's technique, but few listened. Lucy, needing space, wandered into a patch of wild violets. The scent was thick in the air. The ground was soft beneath her shoes. The sky above was blindingly blue. She stood still, breathing in the moment, just for herself. And then George Emerson was there. He hadn't followed her, not intentionally, but there he was, standing at the edge of the field. Their eyes met. He didn't speak. Lucy turned away and slipped. She fell lightly into the violets, her dress spread around her like a watercolor. She wasn't hurt, just surprised. George stepped forward. He didn't ask. He kissed her. It wasn't clumsy or forceful. It was sudden, yes, but full of feeling. The world around them stopped for a moment. Just sky, flowers, and the echo of something deeper than either of them understood. Then came the voice. "Lucy." Charlotte's voice cut through the air like a blade. George stepped back immediately. Lucy scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. Charlotte stood above them on the path, frozen in place, her face pale. No one spoke. George turned and walked away. Lucy brushed the petals from her skirt. Charlotte said nothing until they were back at the carriages. The rest of the journey passed in near silence. Mr. Beebe tried to lighten the mood. Mr. Emerson chatted about springtime and honesty. Mr. Eager offered polite conversation. But for Lucy and Charlotte, something unspoken sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Chapter 7. The return journey from the hills was nothing short of chaotic. Everyone was scattered, emotionally and physically. Lucy drifted away from the group, unsure of how to act or even what she was feeling. Charlotte, usually composed and fussy, had turned unusually quiet since the kiss in the violets. She didn't scold, didn't question. She just kept Lucy close, like someone protecting a valuable secret. Mr. Beebe, who had planned the trip as a relaxing picnic with a philosophical air, now found himself surrounded by confusion. He wandered the hillside trying to gather up the stragglers. George Emerson had gone missing. Mr. Eager was muttering about scandal, and Miss Lavish was nowhere to be found. The carriages sat waiting, their drivers growing impatient as thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The driver of Lucy's carriage, the same one from earlier, Phaethon, was sulking after being reprimanded for kissing his sister. Everyone else seemed preoccupied with their own drama, but Phaethon alone, oddly enough, seemed to understand exactly what had happened between Lucy and George. He had watched from a distance, and, like most who live close to the earth, he read people better than they read themselves. When George finally reappeared, he looked tired but not embarrassed. He offered no explanations. He didn't apologize. He simply climbed into the second carriage with Mr. Beebe and Charlotte. Rain began to fall. Thunder cracked louder overhead. As the carriages descended the winding road back to Florence, the group was tense and mostly silent. Lightning lit the sky. The two women in Lucy's carriage, Lucy and Charlotte, huddled under a small parasol that did little to help. The conversation was hollow, full of mentions of art and weather, but no one addressed what really hung in the air. Another flash. Lucy jumped. "Courage," said Mr. Eager calmly. "There is something almost blasphemous in fearing the elements. They exist to remind us of our place." Charlotte's hand gripped Lucy's gently. It was the first real gesture of warmth she'd given since the kiss, and it mattered. Suddenly, one of the carriages halted. Mr. Emerson, clearly agitated, called out from behind them, "My boy is walking, in this storm." He had learned that George had chosen to walk rather than ride with them, and now the older man was panicking. Mr. Beebe tried to calm him, but Mr. Emerson shouted through the rain, "He might lose his way, he might be struck down." Charlotte looked worried, but it was Lucy who whispered urgently, "Do you think the driver saw?" Charlotte followed Lucy's eyes to Phaethon. "He knows everything," Charlotte said. "He saw." She reached for her purse, pulled out a franc, and tapped the driver on the back. "Silenzio." The boy took the coin. "Va bene," he said quietly. The storm intensified. Thunder rumbled directly above them. Lightning struck a tram pole up the road and sparks flew. The carriages stopped again. Everyone poured out, shouting and checking on one another, but no one was hurt. It was, they agreed, a miraculous escape. In that adrenaline-charged moment, something changed. People began to laugh, to cry, to hold hands. Even Miss Lavish returned, soaked but glowing. The accident, near as it had come, seemed to wipe away old arguments and suspicions. Mr. Beebe made a philosophical remark. Mr. Eager offered a short, shaky prayer. And Lucy? Lucy turned to Charlotte and whispered, "Please, only you can understand. You warned me and I didn't listen. I've been foolish." Charlotte nodded and gave Lucy's hand another squeeze. "Don't cry, dear, we'll talk tonight." Back at the pension, the rain still pouring, the group dispersed to their rooms, exhausted. Lucy stayed beside Charlotte. For the first time in days, she felt less alone, less tangled in her own thoughts. Later, as they prepared for bed, Charlotte closed the door and sat down across from Lucy. "Well," she said quietly, "what is to be done?" Lucy blinked. She hadn't thought that far. She'd only been thinking about what had happened. The kiss, the awkward carriage ride. George's face when he'd looked at her, completely unashamed. I don't know," Lucy said. "Then let me ask you this. How do you plan to keep him quiet?" "Who? George?" "Yes, he kissed you, Lucy. What makes you think he won't talk about it?" Lucy froze. She hadn't considered that. "I'll speak to him," she said finally. Charlotte's eyes widened. "Absolutely not!" Lucy stood. "It's my mess, Charlotte. I'll handle it." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of something larger settling on her, something that went beyond one kiss and one young man. Something was changing, and she couldn't stop it. Chapter 8. The morning after the storm, Florence seemed fresh and washed clean, but Lucy Honeychurch felt anything but renewed. She had barely slept. Her thoughts were a maze, looping endlessly around George Emerson, Charlotte's disapproval, and the memory of that kiss among the violets. She had expected to wake up with a clear head, a sense of direction, maybe even relief. Instead, she woke up feeling cornered. Charlotte was already up, acting as though everything was perfectly normal. She adjusted her gloves, inspected the newspaper, and talked about breakfast like nothing had happened. But Lucy knew that behind the calm tone, Charlotte was watching her carefully, waiting for her to do the right thing. There was no discussion, not really. It was already decided. George Emerson was to be avoided. The kiss was to be forgotten. And Lucy, well, Lucy was expected to carry on as though it had never happened. She sat at the breakfast table, pretending to read a letter from home. The room buzzed with the usual morning routine, teacups clinking, guests murmuring about sightseeing plans. But everything felt distant to her, like she was floating above it all. Mr. Beebe joined them. His face, cheerful as always, gave Lucy a flicker of warmth. He hadn't mentioned anything about the previous day, and she appreciated that. But even he, she suspected, could sense the tension between the two women. The Emersons were not at breakfast. Lucy almost sighed with relief. Then, as she turned a page of her letter, she caught Charlotte glancing at her, not in accusation, but in concern. That look was worse than scolding. It was a silent reminder. You know what you have to do. Later, Charlotte pulled her aside. "We should leave Florence," she said softly. "Soon." Lucy nodded. Yes. She wasn't sure if she was agreeing because she wanted to or because she was supposed to. It didn't matter. The choice had been made. Chapter 9. The decision to leave Florence was made quietly, without drama. No announcements, no tears. Just a train schedule marked and bags slowly packed. For Lucy, it didn't feel like a trip ending. It felt like something being shut away, sealed up before it could grow any bigger. She wasn't running from Florence. She was running from herself. Charlotte handled the travel arrangements. It was her way of taking control again. She moved with quiet efficiency, saying little but overseeing every detail, from hotel bills to the best time to get to the station. Lucy didn't protest. She simply moved through the day like someone in a daze, writing a few polite notes to the friends they'd made at the pension, thanking the Signora for her hospitality, and nodding when Charlotte suggested they avoid saying goodbye to the Emersons altogether. "They'll understand," Charlotte said firmly. "It's best." Lucy nodded again. But when she stepped out into the courtyard one last time and looked up at the windows facing the Arno, she felt an ache she hadn't expected. This place had changed her, not gently, but deeply, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to explain how. As they boarded the carriage for the station, Florence rolled past in soft morning light, sun catching on the river, on the rooftops, on the cobbled streets they'd walked again and again. Miss Lavish passed them on the street, carrying a notebook and talking to herself. She waved cheerfully. Lucy waved back, forcing a smile. At the station, everything moved too quickly. The bustle of porters, the hiss of steam, the clatter of luggage, it drowned out any chance to think. They stepped onto the train just as it began to move. Charlotte looked out the window, satisfied. Lucy kept her eyes on her lap. The train rolled forward. Florence disappeared, and Lucy told herself it was for the best. Chapter 10. Back in England, everything was neat, orderly, and familiar, too familiar. Windy Corner, Lucy's home in the Surrey countryside, welcomed her with its usual comforts. Well-trimmed hedges, punctual meals, and the routine sounds of life that hadn't changed a bit while she'd been away. But Lucy had changed. She walked through the house with a strange sense of detachment. The furniture seemed too stiff, the air too still. The adventure of Florence, the warmth, the danger, the emotional confusion, had been folded away and hidden like a dress she'd outgrown. Mrs. Honeychurch, Lucy's mother, was thrilled to have her daughter back and immediately began talking about plans, callers, and garden parties. Lucy responded politely, but without enthusiasm. Her brother Freddie, always full of energy and half-joking mischief, seemed a little disappointed by her quiet mood. He asked questions about Italy, hoping for tales of drama or romance, but Lucy brushed them off with vague answers. The name Emerson never passed her lips. To distract herself, Lucy threw herself into small tasks. She practiced piano. She organized her wardrobe. She helped her mother with flowers for the drawing room. But everything felt dull, muted, like music played in the wrong key. And then came the expected, but still surprising, visit from Cecil Vyse. Cecil was everything Florence was not: pale, refined, intellectual, and very, very English. He had visited Windy Corner before, but now he returned with a new energy. He was charming in his own awkward, superior way. He quoted poetry and made observations about modern life as though he were lecturing a room full of students. Mrs. Honeychurch adored him. Freddie tolerated him. Lucy wasn't sure. He asked her to marry him. She said no. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no raised voices, just a quiet refusal and a polite exit. But it unsettled her. What did she want then? The next day, Cecil returned, undeterred. He asked again. This time Lucy said yes. Why? Because it seemed easier. Because everyone expected it. Because it would simplify things. Because if she said yes to Cecil, maybe it would erase George Emerson. Cecil beamed, proud and self-satisfied. He took her answer as a victory, not just over doubt, but over the world. He was now engaged to a cultured, respectable young woman from a good family. Windy Corner approved. Florence faded further into the background, and Lucy told herself again that this was for the best. Chapter 11. Cecil Vyse was proud of the engagement, very proud. He didn't say it directly, but everything about the way he moved, spoke, and smiled made it clear that he considered Lucy Honeychurch to be the perfect prize. To him, the engagement was not just romantic, it was aesthetic. Cecil saw himself as an advanced thinker, a man above convention, a person who disliked the crudeness of the middle class and adored books, art, and intellect. And in Lucy, he believed he had found someone who would be shaped, molded into the ideal partner who would fit into his quiet, polished, upper-middle-class London life. Lucy tried to keep up. She listened when he spoke of poetry and literature, nodded when he dismissed Windy Corner as commonplace, and even smiled when he suggested that one day she would leave behind her simple English girl ways. But deep down, Lucy knew something was off. Cecil didn't love her the way George Emerson had once looked at her, with depth, with directness, with something unspoken that still echoed in the corners of her memory. Cecil looked at her like a concept, an ornament, a symbol of something he thought he wanted. He didn't like Freddie much, found him childish, found Mrs. Honeychurch amusing but provincial. He didn't try to connect. He simply tolerated, smiling in that faintly superior way of his. And yet, to everyone else, Cecil was a catch, cultured, successful, respected. Marrying him made perfect sense. So Lucy kept her thoughts to herself. She buried her doubts under polite conversation and well-practiced smiles. She answered letters, she played the piano, she discussed wedding plans when prompted, but the truth lingered under the surface. One afternoon, Cecil sat in the garden reading aloud from a book, offering Lucy his thoughts on love and art and the value of detachment. He believed that emotions were to be observed, not indulged, discussed, but never truly surrendered to. Lucy listened. She didn't interrupt, but she felt something inside her turn colder. Cecil did not see her, not really. And as she watched the wind move through the trees beyond the garden, wild, uncontrolled, free, she wondered, once again, if she was making a mistake. Chapter 12. Life at Windy Corner was beginning to settle into a rhythm again. Lucy's engagement to Cecil Vyse had become part of the household routine, something discussed lightly at meals and gossiped about by neighbors. Mrs. Honeychurch was delighted. Freddie remained skeptical, but kept quiet, and Lucy tried, day by day, to convince herself it was all going according to plan. Then came unexpected news. A cottage nearby had been let to new tenants. It was rare for outsiders to move into the area. Summer Street was a quiet, close-knit place, and newcomers were always a topic of interest. So when it was revealed that the new tenants were named Emerson, Mr. Emerson and his son George, Lucy felt the world lurch beneath her feet. She didn't believe it at first, but it was true. The very people she had left behind in Florence, the father with his strange philosophies, and the son with the kiss she couldn't forget, were now living just a short walk from her front door. And Cecil had been the one to recommend the cottage to the landlord. He thought he'd done a clever thing. "They're quite unconventional," he said with a smug smile. "It will amuse the neighborhood." Lucy could hardly believe it. She stared at him, her voice calm but her thoughts spinning. "Did you know them in Florence?" he asked casually. "Yes," she replied. "They were at the same pension." Cecil, pleased with himself, had no idea what he'd done. Lucy spent the rest of the day in a daze. The landscape outside her window, so peaceful just hours earlier, now felt dangerous. The Emersons, especially George, were part of a past she had locked away, a past she had tried to rewrite with engagement rings and polite conversations. And now they were back, not just back, next door. She wanted to scream at the sky or run or confess everything. Instead, she helped her mother set the table. Chapter 13. The day Lucy saw George Emerson again, it was as if time folded in on itself. She had gone out for a simple walk, something to clear her thoughts. The sky was pale blue, and the fields near Windy Corner were quiet, dotted with summer flowers. She turned down a familiar lane, meaning to circle back home, and there he was. George. He stood under a tree, hands in his pockets, looking out at the countryside. His face was older than she remembered, not aged exactly, just more serious, more worn in. When he turned and saw her, there was no surprise in his expression, no awkwardness, only recognition. "Hello," he said softly. Lucy tried to keep her voice even. "Hello?" They stood there for a moment in silence, the wind tugging gently at the leaves overhead. Then she nodded and walked past him, heart pounding, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't follow her, but the world had changed. Back at Windy Corner, everything looked the same. Her mother was pruning roses. Freddie was complaining about a tennis match. Cecil was reading aloud from a novel, something dry and philosophical. But Lucy felt the shift, like the earth beneath her had turned without anyone else noticing. Later that week, Freddie invited George to join a game of tennis at Windy Corner. He didn't know the history between them, didn't know about Florence or the kiss or the field of violets. Lucy protested, but too mildly. It was already happening. George would be coming, and he did. He arrived in simple clothes with a quiet confidence that unsettled Lucy more than if he'd been nervous. He shook hands with her mother. He greeted Cecil politely. He played tennis like someone who wasn't trying to win, but still did. Lucy watched him move across the lawn with calm intensity. She tried to act casual, laughing at Cecil's dry jokes and talking about the weather, but her mind was full of memories. Florence, the square, the church, the kiss. After the game, as the group walked back to the house, Cecil took a moment to make one of his usual observations, a gentle jab at middle-class tastes or country customs or something equally pompous. George didn't respond, but his silence said more than words. Later, Freddie remarked, "I like him, George. He's real." Lucy said nothing. She didn't know what to think anymore. She had buried George Emerson in the past, in Italy, in memory, and now he was walking through her garden like he belonged. Chapter 14. It was a warm afternoon at Windy Corner, the kind of day that made time slow down. The tennis net was still up, and laughter drifted lazily through the garden. George Emerson had become, in just a few visits, part of the background. Freddie liked him. Even Mrs. Honeychurch approved, calling him quiet but very civil. And Cecil, though less impressed, treated him with aloof tolerance. Lucy was trying very hard to act like everything was normal. She read, made polite conversation, and smiled at all the right moments. But George's presence pressed against her like a weight she carried alone. Every time he looked at her, she felt like the air shifted, like he was trying to say something she didn't want to hear. Cecil, meanwhile, was in one of his self-important moods. He had picked up a book, a dull, old-fashioned novel, and started reading aloud, mocking it as he went. He made fun of the characters, the setting, the simplicity of the writing. It was beneath him, he said. Mediocre fiction for mediocre minds. George, sitting a little ways off, didn't laugh. Lucy wasn't laughing either. Then, halfway through one of the scenes, Cecil reached a passage that made him pause. It described a man, young, intense, who kissed a woman suddenly in a field of violets. There was silence. Lucy froze. Cecil looked up, frowning slightly. "What a ridiculous, over-romantic scene," he muttered, then laughed. "I suppose people find that thrilling." No one responded. Lucy turned pale. That wasn't just fiction. That was her. That was them. She suddenly realized what had happened, how that scene had made its way into the book. Miss Lavish. Of course. The pompous novelist from Florence who had seen too much and written it down in her Italian novel. George looked away. He knew. She stood abruptly, the book slipping from her lap. "I'm going inside," she said. "Are you unwell?" Cecil asked, clueless. "I'm tired." She didn't wait for a response. Inside, she leaned against the wall, her heart racing. The violets, the kiss, Florence. It had all been locked away, and now someone had printed it, bound it in pages, and handed it to her future husband to mock out loud. The past wasn't buried. It was blooming again, uninvited. Chapter 15. The day after Cecil unknowingly read out Lucy's secret from the pages of Miss Lavish's novel, the air at Windy Corner was tense, though no one could have said exactly why. Lucy avoided George. She avoided everyone, really. She stayed busy with chores, pretended to read, and carefully built a wall between herself and her feelings. It wasn't that she didn't know what she felt. It was that she couldn't afford to feel it. Not now. Not when she was engaged. Cecil remained oblivious, treating George with his usual brand of distant civility, unaware that he had set fire to something he couldn't see. He had read aloud the memory of a kiss and mocked it in front of everyone. And George had said nothing. Lucy had said nothing. But something had shifted. The next day, George was invited to play tennis again. It was a casual afternoon. Friends, sunshine, the usual chatter. But Lucy could feel something boiling just under the surface. George was quieter than usual. He played fiercely, but without joy. And when the game ended, he wandered off by himself. Lucy found him standing at the edge of the lawn, staring out over the view. He didn't turn when she approached. "I suppose you think that scene in the book was funny," she said, trying to sound sharp. George finally looked at her. "I didn't laugh." "You should have," she added quickly. "It's nonsense, all of it." He took a step closer. "Was it nonsense?" Lucy swallowed. "Yes. No, it wasn't." He said it calmly, not as a challenge, but as a truth he couldn't pretend away. His eyes met hers, steady and unafraid. "You love the wrong man." Lucy felt her heart lurch. "You don't," she said weakly. "I'm engaged." George's voice didn't rise. "You don't love him?" "I do." "You don't." It was so simple, so direct, and it shattered the carefully stacked arguments in Lucy's head. "He doesn't see you," George continued. "Not really. He sees someone he wants to shape, someone who fits into his life. But I see you, and I love you." Lucy shook her head. "Stop it." He stepped back, giving her space, but his voice was steady. "This isn't Florence. There's no excuse now." She stared at him, words caught in her throat. And then she turned and ran, not toward the house, but into the garden, into the trees, where no one could see her face. Later, when she came back, George was gone, and the wall she had built between her past and present had cracked straight through the middle. Chapter 16. Lucy stayed in her room most of the next day. No walks, no tennis, no music. She kept the curtains open but didn't really see the view. Windy Corner felt like a stage she no longer knew how to act on. Charlotte noticed, of course. She hovered, offering tea, asking vague questions. But Lucy said very little. She had no words left that wouldn't unravel everything. She was still reeling from George's confrontation in the garden. His words had landed like stones, heavy, unshakable. "You love the wrong man." It rang in her ears even now. Cecil came by that afternoon with a book in hand and that usual air of intellectual detachment. He mentioned George only briefly. "Quite intense, isn't he?" And then moved on to talk about an essay he was writing. Lucy nodded. She didn't want to talk about George. She didn't want to talk about anything. And yet it was all she could think about. Later, when she was alone again, she made her decision. She couldn't marry Cecil. It wasn't just George. It wasn't even love. Not yet. It was about freedom, about truth, about no longer living in fear of what other people thought was right for her. George had simply been the first to say it aloud. She went downstairs and found Cecil in the drawing room, pacing slowly with a book tucked under his arm. "I can't marry you," she said. He stopped mid-step. "What?" "I'm sorry, I thought I could, but I can't." For a moment, he looked genuinely stunned, not hurt, just surprised. Then came the questions, the polite confusion, the slightly defensive tone. "Have I offended you? Is it my manner?" "No," she said. "It's me. I just don't feel what I should feel." He sat down, slowly, like someone trying to understand a bad review of their work. "I see. You don't," she said gently. "But that's all right." Cecil wasn't cruel. He wasn't even angry. But in the end, the conversation made it clear. They had never really seen each other. Not fully. Not truly. Their engagement had been built on convenience, on expectation, not on love. When Cecil left Windy Corner that evening, he was quiet, composed, a little sad, but still himself. Lucy watched him walk away from the window. It was done. She had chosen something else. Not someone, not yet, but a different kind of life. And for the first time in weeks, she breathed a little easier. Chapter 17. Windy Corner was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not destructive, but decisive. The engagement was over and the news had begun to settle like dust in the corners of the house. Lucy's mother was surprised, but not outraged. She had always liked Cecil, but in that vague, polite way English mothers often did. Freddie, on the other hand, was thrilled. "I knew you didn't like him," he said smugly. "He was a bore." Lucy didn't reply. What no one knew was that she hadn't told them the whole story. She hadn't said George Emerson's name, not once. She kept that part locked away, safely hidden in her chest, like something too valuable and too dangerous to bring into the daylight. That evening, Charlotte entered the drawing room. She carried her usual presence, dignified, slightly stiff, protective. Lucy was at the piano, playing quietly, not Beethoven this time, something gentler. Charlotte sat. "I heard about Cecil," she said, not looking at Lucy. "Yes," Lucy replied. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. "It was the right decision." Lucy paused. "You didn't think it was the right decision a week ago." "No," Charlotte admitted, "but I do now." Silence settled between them again. Then, without warning, Charlotte said, "You mustn't see George Emerson again." Lucy's hands froze on the keys. "I'm not seeing him," she said quietly. "I know," Charlotte replied. "But you might. And I want to ask you, beg you, not to." Lucy turned toward her, confused. "Why?" Charlotte looked tired. "Because I know how these things go. I've seen them. Passion, Lucy, is not always kind. It's not always safe. You think George is unsafe? I think you're vulnerable, and I think he loves you. That kind of love is overwhelming." Lucy stood. "Charlotte, please." Charlotte rose too, her voice softer now. You're very young and very honest, but you can't always afford to be. Lucy looked down. Then what should I be? Careful. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even judgmental. It was fear, a kind of protective fear that came from Charlotte's own quiet heartbreaks, the ones she never spoke about. Lucy said nothing. Charlotte walked to the door, paused, then turned. Promise me you won't see him. Lucy hesitated, then nodded. I promise. But her heart wasn't in the words, and Charlotte knew it. Chapter 18. With the engagement called off and the atmosphere at Windy Corner tense and uncertain, Lucy announced that she would be going away. It wasn't dramatic. She simply told her mother she needed time to visit relatives, a change of scenery. She didn't say it was to escape the gossip or the awkward questions or her own confusion. But that's exactly what it was. She began packing slowly, carefully folding clothes she didn't want to wear and books she probably wouldn't read. Everything about the process felt performative, as if she were preparing for a role, not a journey. Charlotte, ever present, hovered just enough to make her presence known without intruding. Mrs. Honeychurch was perplexed. You don't need to run away, she said. You haven't done anything wrong. But Lucy didn't explain, because how could she? She couldn't say that every hallway at Windy Corner reminded her of George Emerson, of the days she saw him playing tennis, the way he looked at her, the kiss in Florence, the moment he said she was marrying the wrong man. She wouldn't say that she was no longer sure who she was without those memories. So she packed. Outside, the weather had shifted. The sun had cooled, the wind stronger, as if summer were slowly giving way to something more serious. Freddie tried to cheer her up. He talked nonsense, made jokes, asked her if she'd come watch a cricket match. But Lucy was somewhere else entirely. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes anymore. Cecil sent a short letter, formal, courteous. She read it, then burned it. As she finished folding her last dress, she found a photograph tucked into her drawer. It was old, slightly bent. A group picture from Florence, the Pension Bertolini, people smiling. George wasn't looking at the camera. He never did. She almost put it in the fire, too. But then she stopped. She placed it quietly into the bottom of her case and shut the lid. It was time to go. Chapter 19. Lucy hadn't meant to return to Florence. She had planned to visit distant relatives in Greece. A polite escape, far from Windy Corner, far from George Emerson, far from anything resembling emotion. But somehow, as if drawn by an invisible thread, her journey curved back to where everything had begun. Florence. The city hadn't changed. The Arno still flowed gently under the bridges. The Duomo still cast its long, holy shadow. The street still buzzed with life, color, and the perfume of the past. But Lucy had changed. She checked into a small pension, not the Bertolini, of course, and told herself it was just a place to stay. She walked the streets like a tourist again, Baedeker in hand, but everything felt too familiar to be foreign. Then one afternoon, while walking through a quiet square, she turned a corner and stopped. There he was, George Emerson. He was standing near the Uffizi, looking almost exactly as she remembered, serious, still, entirely present. His hands were in his pockets, and he hadn't seen her yet. She almost turned around, but something in her, perhaps courage, perhaps something even simpler, held her there. He looked up. Their eyes met. No one moved for a moment. No one spoke. And then she smiled, not a forced smile, not the polite one she used at home, a real one. He walked toward her. Lucy, he said, his voice quiet. I didn't know you were still here, she replied, equally soft. I live here now, he said, at least for a while. They stood in silence again. "You came back," he said. "I didn't mean to," she admitted, "but I think I needed to." George nodded, and in that moment everything made sense. There were no more speeches, no defenses, no pretending, just two people standing in the city where it all began, finally telling the truth, not with words, but with the kind of silence that only comes when something deep inside you finally rests. Chapter 20. George and Lucy stood together in Florence, not as tourists or ghosts from a memory, but as two people who had come through confusion, fear, expectation, and chosen something else. Each other. They returned to the Pension Bertolini, not to stay, but to stand in the very place where it all began. The old walls were the same. The framed notices, the stiff chairs, the portraits of poets and queens, all unchanged. And yet, everything was different now. Lucy stepped into the same room she had once shared with Charlotte. It faced the Arno. It was at last a room with a view. She crossed to the window and looked out. The sun was low, gilding the river and rooftops in gold. Bells rang faintly from across the city. Life bustled below. Carts, children, voices. The same view she had longed for on her very first day. George joined her at the window. For a while they didn't speak. There was no need. They both knew what it had taken to arrive here. The promises broken, the pride swallowed, the truths finally said aloud. "You remember what you said in the church?" Lucy asked quietly. "About finding the yes beside the everlasting why?" He nodded. "I think I finally understand what you meant." She turned to him. There was no hesitation this time. She kissed him. There would still be challenges ahead, families to explain to, judgments to endure, the unpredictable future waiting beyond the frame of this moment. But they had chosen each other, not because it was easy, but because it was real. And in that small, quiet room above the river, with the sun setting and Florence breathing around them, Lucy Honeychurch and George Emerson stood side by side, facing life honestly, freely, fully, together. Epilogue. George and Lucy stayed in Florence through the spring. They found a small apartment not far from the Arno, with creaky floorboards and tall windows that let in golden light every morning. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was theirs. Their days were simple. Walks through the piazzas, quiet dinners, occasional letters from England. Sometimes they talked about the past, Windy Corner, Charlotte, the Violets. But mostly they lived in the present, building a life not shaped by expectations, but by choice. It wasn't always easy. There were days of silence, of stubbornness, of learning how to be fully seen and still remain yourself. But they kept choosing each other, again and again, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And that, Lucy had come to understand, was the view she had longed for all along. Not the Arno, not the hills of Fiesole, but a life she could see clearly and step into freely, side by side.